Now we are going to discuss about the architecture of Struts framework and Struts request handling life cycle along with its controller classes. Let us start with an introduction part. What is Struts framework? Struts is an open source framework and it can be integrated in your dynamic web projects for performing client as well as server-side validations. It extends Java Servlet's API and it uses model view controller 2 architecture. Struts is an open source framework from Apache Software Foundation for developing well-architected web applications. So it enables you to create maintainable, extensible and flexible web applications based on standard technologies such as JSP, servlets, Java Bean components, resource bundles and XML. Struts framework uses model view controller 2 architecture. Before discussing about the architecture of Struts framework, you should have an idea about model view controller 2 architecture. What is MVC 2 architecture? Model view controller 2 architecture is a cornerstone for all serious and industrial strength web applications designed in the real world. The following figure shows model view controller 2 architecture. So just imagine you are the client, you are giving some request to the web application that uses model view controller 2 architecture. Here controller is a servlet that handles client's request. After receiving the request from the client, the controller servlet instantiates an appropriate Java Bean component based on the request parameters. Normally inside your web module you will be having Java Bean components to persist the data between requests. After instantiating the Java Bean component, the controller servlet will communicate the database through its controller helper class. After getting the informations from the database, the controller helper class will update your Java Bean component with informations. Then your controller servlet will set the resultant Java Beans either in session or in application or in request scope. Finally, the controller servlet dispatches the client's request to the next view based on the URL. The view part uses Java Bean components to display the data in the client view. Model view controller design pattern can be divided into three parts such as model, view and controller. Model is responsible for providing the data from the database and saving the data into the data store. Your application's business logic is implemented in the model. Normally, the data entered by the user are checked in the model before saving into the database. Coming to view part represents the client-side view of your application. It dispatches a client's request to the controller servlet and then receives response from the controller to display the data to the user. HTML, Java server pages are part of view component. Third one is controller. Here controller is the servlet. It acts as a bridge between model and view. and it is responsible for handling the client's request. Once the client's request is received, the controller servlet executes an appropriate business logic from the model and produces the data to the user by using view component. Coming to the Struts framework architecture, this diagram shows an architecture of Struts framework. First, we are going to talk about an important controller classes of Struts framework, such as action servlet, action, and action form. Here, action servlet is a controller servlet. There is only one controller servlet for the entire web application. The action servlet class resides in org.apache.struts.action package, which extends HTTP servlet class, and it is configured in the web.xml file as a normal servlet. What is the function of action servlet? What it does? As we discussed earlier, the controller servlet is responsible for receiving the request from the client. Once the request is received from the client, the action servlet reads struts config.xml file to map the incoming requests to the action object and instantiates action form bean. Next one is action class, which resides in org.apache.struts.action package. Action class has one method called as execute. What is the function of action object? The action object processes the data stored in the action form bean by using its execute method. It invokes the application's business logic. Action object acts as a wrapper around your business logic and provides an interface to the application's model layer. Once the action object processes the data stored in the action form bean, it forwards a client's request to an appropriate view. If you want, you can create your own action class. Your own action class must be the subclass of this predefined action class. And third one is action form. In Struts, action form is a normal Java bean. Normally, inside of our Java bean component, you will be having properties corresponding to the HTTP request parameters along with public getter and setter methods. In Struts, your action form is also having attributes or properties corresponding to the HTTP request parameters along with public getter and setter methods. What is the use of action form? Action form can be used to process data between requests. The action form, this predefined action form class resides in org.apache.struts.action package. If you want, you can create your own action form, but your own action form must be the subclass of this predefined action form class. You have to create action form for every HTTP request. We will see one example for action form. Here, the name of the action form is login form, which extends that predefined action form class. In Struts, action form is a Java bean. So inside of my own action form, I'm having two properties such as first name and last name corresponding to the HTTP request parameters along with public getter and setter methods. What is the use of action form bean? Action form bean can be used to persist the data between requests. Now here I have created my own action form bean to save the data entered by the user at the time of login. Next one is an example of action class. Here the name of the action class is login action, which extends that predefined action class. Action class provides execute method. So instead of my own action class, I am overriding that execute method. What is the use of action object? Action object processes the data stored in the action form bean by using its execute method. So inside the execute method, we are processing the data stored in the action form bean. Once the action object processes the data, it forwards the client's request to either success page or to the failure page. Now we are going to talk about Struts request handling lifecycle and the role of its controller classes. Your Struts application is handling the client's request by using its controller classes. The controller classes such as action servlet, request processor, action form, action mapping, and action forward are in org.apache.struts.action package. Let us start with an action servlet class. As we discussed earlier, in Struts, action servlet is a controller servlet. There is only one controller servlet for the entire web application, and it is responsible for receiving the client's request. Once a client request is received, the action servlet reads Struts configuration file and loads it into the memory. How action servlet reads Struts configuration file? Normally inside your web module you will be having web application deployment descriptor file called as web.xml. So inside the web.xml file you will be configuring action servlet as a normal servlet. At the same time, here I am passing one initial parameter called as config to the action servlet class. Here the name of the initial parameter is config, whose value specifies the path of the Struts configuration file. So on startup, action servlet reads Struts configuration file. In the second step, action servlet intercepts HTTP requests based on the URL pattern. Here the URL pattern can be either suffix or path. The URL pattern is defined in the web.xml file. In between servlet mapping element, we are having two sub-elements such as servlet name and URL pattern. Here servlet name sub-element identifies your action servlet by using the name action. The URL pattern specifies the suffix. Here I have given .do as suffix. So the URL ends with .do will be intercepted and handled by the action servlet class. After the Struts configuration file is loaded into the memory, the request processor class does the following things by using its process method. First, it will retrieve an appropriate XML block from the Struts configuration file for the URL In the second step, it will look up the configuration file for the URL pattern. In the third step, it will instantiate your action form bean. In the fourth step, it will populate the properties of your action form bean. In the fifth step, it will check the validate attribute of the action mapping element of Struts configuration file. Finally, it will instantiate an appropriate action class. We will discuss one by one. In the first step, request processor retrieves an XML block from the Struts configuration file for the URL. That XML block is referred as action mapping in Struts terminology. In fact, there is a class called as action mapping in org.apache.struts.action package, which holds the mapping between a URL and action. So in the first step, the request processor retrieves an action mappings element from the Struts configuration file for the URL. In the second step, the request processor looks up action mappings element for the URL pattern. Here I have given /login as URL pattern to the path attribute of action map of action element. Here a type attribute specifies which action class has to be instantiated. Here the action mapping element tells Struts how to map the request URL with the path /login to the action class. In our case, we have the name of the action class is login action. In the third and the fourth steps, the request processor instantiates your action form bean and puts it in an appropriate scope, either in request or in application or in session scope. How the request processor instantiates your action form bean? Here we have one more attribute called as name in the action element, which uses logical name of your action form bean. Normally you will be configuring your action form beans in between form beans element of Struts configuration file. Here I am defining my own action form bean in between form beans element of Struts configuration file. In between form beans element, I have form bean sub element, which has two attributes such as name and type. Here name attribute specifies the logical name of your action form bean. Here type specifies which action form bean has to be instantiated. In my case, the name of the action form is login form. I have given the same logical name to the name attribute of action element. So the request processor instantiates an action form bean and populates its properties. The request processor also determines the scope by looking at the scope attribute in the same action mapping to put your action form in the scope. After instantiating your action form bean, in the fifth step, the request processor checks the validate attribute of the action element. If the validate attribute is set to true, then the request processor invokes the validate method of action form bean object. What is the use of validate method? Validate is a method where you can put all the HTML form data validations. The validate method returns action errors object. It contains or it encapsulates validation errors. If no errors are found, then action errors object will not have any recorded error messages. If there are errors, then an individual action error object is created and added to the action errors. So here I have a code that uses validate method for validating the properties of your action form bean. So as we discussed earlier, action form bean can be used to persist data between records. It means the data entered by the user are stored in the action form bean properties. So inside the validate method, we are validating the action form bean properties such as first name and email. Suppose if the validation fails, when you validate the first name property of your action form bean, then add method of action errors object will be called. That method accepts two objects. First one is an object of string. Second one is an object of action message. Here action message object specifies an individual error which contains message key to be looked up in an appropriate application resources file. So if errors are found, then action errors object will have recorded error messages. Action errors will be reported to the Struts framework. If no errors are found, then finally the request processor instantiates your action class. Finally, the request processor instantiates your action class specified in the action element, and it also invokes its execute method. What is the use of action object and its execute method? The action object processes the data stored in the action form bean by using its execute method. In other words, the execute method of action class is used to invoke your application's business logic, which returns action forward. How the action forward object is returned? The action forward object is returned by the find forward method of action mapping class. Here we are calling the find forward method by invoking the action mapping instance, which returns an object of action forward. What it contains? The association of logical name and the physical JSP page are encapsulated in the action forward instance. So where the logical name and the corresponding physical JSP page are defined in the struts configuration file, in between action element you will be having forward sub element, which has two attributes such as name and path. Here name specifies the logical name of the physical JSP page. Path attribute specifies the path of the JSP page. Here inside the find forward method we have given the logical name success. The find forward method searches the forward with the name success and returns forward action forward object. Finally the execute method returns action forward object. Suppose if the action forward object encapsulates the success logical name and the physical JSP page success.jsp. Then the request processor returns success.jsp to the user. So far we have discussed about the architecture of Struts framework and its request handling lifecycle. Thanks for joining.